Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Turning Point Podcast, stories and strategies from the world of business. I'm Blaine Birch, your host, CEO at Dryrun. And today joining me is Jeff Archibald, the CEO of Paperleaf, an app development company. And I think you've been through probably a few iterations over the years. And but Jeff and I have known each other for a long time. His company has grown by leaps and bounds and is doing some amazing stuff. And I'm so glad to have you on the show today, Jeff.
Thanks for having me, Blaine. Good seeing you.
Yeah, you too. So let's go back. I know we've known each other for years here, but let's go back to how did you get started in the industry, and where'd you come from?
Actually, to bring it way back, I came out of the education program at the University of Alberta, and that actually got me working in health and safety, and that's where I ended up working with designers and developers to create health and safety programs, which kind of piqued my interest in design and development as an industry. So that in turn led to me going back to school and getting a diploma in design. And then I started the company in, I don't know, whatever it's 11 years ago, 2009, with a partner, Andrea. And we were just the two of us working out of the house. And we were, just kind of your do anything that comes with a paycheck sort of graphic design company. So I did everything from websites, which I charged $1,000 for, to to like business cards. If someone's just like, I need one business card, I'd be like, cool, $50. And I remember one time even somebody hired us to clone stamp out somebody from their wedding photos, like in Photoshop. So like remove somebody. I was like, sure, whatever. So we started there, and kind of went through various iterations, as you kind of said, over the years.
Yeah. So where did you go? Like, so when did I guess you move from the two-person shop to just getting a little bit bigger, or maybe stepped out into an office? I know everyone now, if you're listening to this now, and it's August, middle of COVID season, and everyone's working from the house, but
yeah, prime COVID.
Yeah. But normally, like, when did you start to grow the company and move sort of outside of working out of the house?
Took us a few years, probably 3 years before we hired anybody. That was probably, it wasn't strategic at all. It was more just how we were wired. We were like, we just want to work for ourselves, and we don't want to have the stress of, salaries and payroll and all that kind of stuff. But, at that stage, you don't really know what you don't know. So we started to grow very, very slowly and very, very unstrategically, by just hiring. I was doing design and development, and I was always kind of a bad programmer. So the first person we hired was a web developer, and that was because I was too busy and not confident in that area. And then, and she worked out of our house actually. And the next person we hired, I think, was another designer, because I was getting too caught up in that. And so I shifted over to a bit more project management stuff with a bit of design art direction. And so that was probably around the 3-year mark. And then we kind of slowly grew by 1-2 people a year. And at the same time, we kind of refined our focus a little bit from do anything under the sun to focusing only on websites and visual identities. So a lot of people would come to us new or, small businesses that needed an update to their logo and stationery and a website. We charge 10 or 15 or 20 grand or whatever. And we were kind of doing that work. So then, we hired a project manager and another designer and a couple developers. And over the course of those years, we kind of kept growing. I think we're in our 11th year now. And, we've recently kind of repositioned again. But, at around the 10-year mark, I think we were at about 16, 17 people. And we were focused on just digital work. We scratched the visual identity stuff, and we're only focusing on larger scale websites and applications. And so, we kind of slowly grew that way, mostly just filling up the areas where I was getting too slammed. It was very much like a reactive growth strategy, not a proactive one at all.
Yeah. And it's such a familiar story, and not just to me personally, because I uh, sort of started out in the creative field as well, and it was a sort of a similar strategy for a while, where it was like the me, myself, and I, and then we started to grow, and
Totally.
then we, you know, started basically, like you said, patching holes and growing, and there wasn't a lot of strategy for quite a long time, but it was probably the same thing. You start to get around that 5, 6, 7 year mark,
Yeah.
and I remember making, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, but I remember at some point you wake up one morning and you realize, like, I'm no longer a designer. Like, I thought of myself as
Yeah.
a designer when I started, and at some point, and it doesn't take very long, you're just not that anymore. It takes a while to
Totally.
realize that, and then at some point you realize, I'm actually uh, like I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a businessman, I'm trying to grow this company.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of a mental shift, and I think that happens in a lot of industries where people come in as domain experts and grow into a position. And where, like, did you ever hit that point where you felt like you're suddenly, you know, entrepreneur and more than designer?
Yeah. Like, I remember specifically kind of having this light bulb moment. And this was when we were, and this will partially answer one of your previous questions, but when we were in our first office, which was ultra tiny, and I think there was only 4 of us when we were in there, and then we moved out when there were 7, and we couldn't back up without our chairs hitting each other. But I remember in that office having this moment where I was like, I need to sort of pick a path here. I can either pick the craft path, and I can really pursue being, like a creative director or that kind of person. But then, because my partner Andrea, she wasn't going to pursue the business path. That's just not how she's wired. So it's like, well, then I'm going to need help on that aspect. Or I can pick that aspect, learn how to actually be, better at business, better at sales, all that kind of stuff, and then find someone who's actually better than me at the creative and development side. So I had this moment, and I kind of sat with it for a while. And I was like, you know what? I've been crushing out strategy and production design work for, not like a decade or anything, but at that point it was probably like 5 or 6 years. And I was like, I can't, I'm good. I like making stuff, but I can make stuff and fill that part of my life in other areas.
Mm-hmm.
And I just didn't see a feasible path for growth in the company if I didn't, kind of take that creative hat off a little bit and put on the business hat, which, for me, it was fine because I like challenges and I like learning new things. And I think I'm an adaptable person. But yeah, it almost felt like I always would make this joke that I would be learning things that I feel like people learned in their first year of business school. You know what I mean? Where I'm just like,
Yeah.
I'm like 29 years old or 30 years old or something, and be like, oh, PO numbers, cool, that's what these are for. All that weird stuff you have to figure out. But yeah, I think you hear that story a lot, like both yours and mine, where it's like you start as a craftsperson, you're just content doing the work, but then all of a sudden you realize you're wearing 1,000 hats. And for me, the growth was never about money or anything like that. The growth was always just about finding sustainability and not burning out, which is a constant battle anyways. But
Yeah.
my logic there was there is a size or a range of sizes for companies like ours where it is sustainable and people can have the appropriate amount of responsibility and the appropriate skill set. And what it isn't is like 4 people where, I have to be a project manager, a front and back end developer, a designer, a QA analyst, a content writer, all of that stuff. Like I can do all of those jobs shittily and I can't do any of them particularly well.
Yeah, that's yeah, such a common story, and that's the thing that I hear all the time, especially in the creative industry, and it was the same with us. Is growth was never about money. It was always about just these aspirations to build something and to have and have that some sort of stability, and it wasn't growth for growth's sake. It was just let's just build something that can run and that's stable. And one of the challenges that was a big shift for us was bringing discipline. And I've talked about this before with where Dryrun comes from, was first bringing discipline into like our cash flow and our processes around the 2008, 2009 recession. One of the biggest things for us is bringing discipline into the sales process. And so there's some, there were some tactics there. There was some processes there, and there was some way of not just sort of talking with people, but how do you actually get it in and deal with the troughs, the highs and lows, and
Right.
smooth out your sales. And how have you sort of tackled that as you've grown?
It's a good question. Like when we started, it was just probably the same as everybody, right? Work would just appear. And, when we really, really started, we had so much downtime that we were just like writing blog posts and going to meetups and just naturally doing the things that plant the seeds for sales down the road. But then as we started to grow, I became super uncomfortable with hoping work would come in. That whole idea that hope is not a strategy, and not having any real handle on sales, and just hoping that a few emails are going to show up this month that would amount to enough work. So I read a book called Predictable Revenue a few years ago, which was written by the guy who kind of put Salesforce's, it was more of an outbound strategy in place. And so it's very, very heavy outbound and SaaS focused, which, for a consulting firm like us who builds mobile and web apps doesn't really jive. But what it did put in place for me was a whole idea of processes and how to actually use a CRM and selling and operating the business by numbers. So I read that book and then, translated that into processes that work for us, hired somebody who could help me on the business development side with regards to, like vetting leads, finding RFPs, writing responses, all that kind of stuff. And then, we just really operate by the numbers. Like this morning, I just had our weekly sales call and we're like, okay, we're looking at the figures. We have all of our goals set. Our top of the funnel is doing really well. Like a whole bunch of potential work came in the door. And that was like, so our deals and the value of those deals, those are all great for the month. But we haven't won enough this month and we're behind our pace, and we haven't sent out enough proposals or proposal value, and that's behind our pace. So that's going to be our focus. So what are the three things we can move from needs discovered into proposal lane? So we have those kinds of calls so we can really focus. Alongside the honestly, the more difficult stuff, which is like figuring out who your target market is and figuring out which projects you should actually respond to and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. But that was like, adopting those methods was such a huge point for me in with regards to being able to sleep well at night. I was kind of in a state of ignorant bliss a few years ago, where there's probably times where we were like, a month away from losing all of our cash, and I had no idea because I was just kind of like making logos,
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, been there.
Yeah.
It's well, one of the things that I guess the other thing that I sort of piqued my interest a bit is you talked about getting more and more specialized, and that's where I find businesses, like, I know you start your business and it's like anyone that's got a buck, anyone that's got a project you're kind of doing, and to grow successfully, it's sometimes hard to make the transition to know that, look, we have to be disciplined. We maybe have to go to a specific vertical. We have to be very specific on what we offer. We have to be the best in the world at something.
Yeah.
And it's hard sometimes to take that leap, but that's how businesses are successful. And when I guess, or like you said, just sort of relatively recently, you've started to really focus. And what was that kind of journey like, where you started to say, okay, this is where we're good, this is where we can really excel, this is where we can be the best? How did you make that transition there?
It was tough, and actually we hired a firm to help us with it, specifically, and their position is on point. They're marketing for experts, and specifically agencies a lot, and so they helped us through the whole positioning thing. Good. And this, feel free to cut me off, Blaine, because I can talk about this stuff for ages because I find it so interesting, but I'll try to give the abridged version of how we kind of came to where we were.
Yeah.
So like we were, basically just kind of positioned as your generic website company. Like we make big websites and we make them well, and we have a bit more design in our DNA than a lot of places. But in reality, when you're looking at us and the three other competitors on the bid, we don't have a lot that can really differentiate ourselves. Mm-hmm. What we did uncover as we were going through this kind of these positioning conversations with our positioning firm, was that, like, if we were to continue to pursue the website side of things, we would have to pretty dramatically restructure the company, because in my opinion, websites are largely about marketing and lead gen problems and communication problems. They aren't necessarily technical problems. Some are, maybe 20% of the 100% are like technical problems, which is where we excel. We like building the technology, but we're not a marketing company. And so, we would have had to totally restructure our roles and bring in much more content and marketing help, and basically become some semblance of a marketing agency. And I didn't want to do that.
Yeah.
And then the projects that and also the other side of that is like the margins on websites, and the revenue from those projects is just going down and down and down as it's getting eaten up from the bottom end by Squarespace and DIY tools. So we're looking at those and going, man, like all of these projects, not really where we want to be. But the mobile and web app side, those are much more complex. They are often about technology and process problem solving, which is what we like to do and what we're good at. So we started to focus on that. And then when it comes down to positioning, we were like, well, ideal positioning is, you do X for Y, you do service for industry, right? And, with our current focus and case studies and everything, the only X for Y sort of vertical positioning we could have had was like, we do websites for nonprofits, or we do websites for industry associations. But to be honest, I didn't want to pursue that. It's RFPs, it's slim dollars. It's, again, that restructuring of the company.
As soon as I say RFP, I get a cold chill up my back. We just abandoned them. I remember in our business at one point, they were so awful that it's tough.
It's a necessary evil sometimes, but it's not the best. But that's just how all of those places procure stuff. So you're just giving up and saying, I'm going to be doing this for a long time. But then realistically, on the mobile and web app side, we have a very diverse set of experience across multiple industries, but it's not like we've delivered 10 mobile apps for financial services and understand financial services intricately, right? So we can't honestly and ethically say we're an application development company for financial services or any industry. But we need to narrow our positioning somewhat, right? We can't just be an application development firm. So our strategy is a multi-year one with positioning, where what we're doing right now is saying, within Alberta, where we are, there's enough work to sustain us. And we think we can own that position as Alberta's expert app development firm. And so that's our strategy over the first year, maybe 2 years. And as we start to take on more and more of these projects within Alberta, and obviously we'll work outside of Alberta, I'm talking about where we're focusing our marketing and advertising effort and spend. As we get more and more experience in that niche, in the regional positioning, then we'll focus down afterwards into a very specific industry. So right now we're Alberta's expert app development firm. And then within 2 years, we'll be, app development for industry, once we figure out what that is. But we couldn't realistically dive into that vertical industry-based niche yet and do that honestly.
Yeah. And it's having that sort of direction, I imagine, helps with your sales process and your advertising, sort of moving towards a niche, knowing down the road that's the goal is to be the best in this industry on the planet, kind of thing. And that's
totally.
And it's not something you do overnight. Like it takes time, and it sounds like having that strategy in place is so critical for you. Like, it's interesting because you've like I say, you just, like so many businesses, you start in a very unstructured, very not a lot of process, and it's and just with over the number of years, you've shifted to a growing business, a larger business, but very much based on process and strategy and messaging and a longer term vision. And it's interesting to see how that's what leads to success, and that's what's led you all the way through is this discipline and moving in that direction.
Yeah, I think you need to do it, you know what I mean? And there needs to be a plan. That's why I'm okay with the regional positioning, you know what I mean? Because there is a plan down the road, and it gives us room to adapt, and we're not going to be dogmatic about it. But like, the hardest part, I think, with positioning for a lot of people is the idea that you're leaving all of this potential other work on the table, right? But that is one thing, at least for me, where I just kind of had to say, you know what, you need to listen to the experts here. I'm not an expert on positioning or marketing. but there are people who do it for a living and they seem to do very well. So I'm going to buy into it, and I'm going to, kind of dive into the deep end there. And I'm going to believe what they say, that if you narrow down your niche and you pick the right focus, then you'll actually make more than if you're a generalist.
Yeah.
And plus, then, like, further to your direct point, you can start to hone your process and hone your strategy in a specific area and actually get really, really good at it. You know what I mean? Like, as it comes to application development, it's very, very similar on some level to website design and development, but it's actually a lot different too. And you start to learn different techniques and models and technical things and whatever else that you never would have learned if you kept trying to be the visual identity, website, web development, do it all firm rather.
Yeah.
So I think that part's super critical, but I imagine everybody listening has either been through, is going through, or will go through the kind of mental hurdles around positioning where you're just kind of like, right, but I know I should narrow, but I'm worried about leaving all of this work behind. Or I know I should narrow, but I'm worried that there's not going to be enough work in this niche. And there are ways to figure out those problems. And I think it's well worth it, as you could probably attest to, right, with your experiences with Dryrun.
Oh yeah, we went through the same process. Even though I'd been through, my last business was, we were starting to do the same sort of direction when I sold the business, and with Dryrun, it's kind of the same thing. We kind of roll it out. It's like, well, people have cash flow problems. Everybody come try Dryrun. And now
why would I leave people out? Why would I exclude people?
Exactly. Right? And it's not like we're like, hey, we're going to kick you out the door if you're not. But what happens is we start to realize, like, this is where we're good at. Like, we deal with volatility and complexity better than anybody else. We have freedom and flexibility that no one else has. That means that we deal really well with these really volatile industries with big transactions, that's what we built, and that's where we keep making it better and better and better. And that means we're starting to go more and more into, a specific sort of business size and specific verticals. And we know the same thing as kind of you, like, this is where we're at today. This is where we are a year from now. This is where we are 2 years from now. And it's going to be fundamentally different and more focused. It's just, you're constantly bringing in that focus. It's a bit of a hard lesson to learn. And it is like, it's sometimes scary to take the leap off the cliff and go, okay, we're going to raise our prices and we're going to do this, we're going to do that. But this is where we offer the value. And it's a tricky thing for any business to go through to really focus. But, successful ones, that's what they do. From, it's like, we got the best, not just pizza, we got the best, like, Italian flatbread pizza, like,
totally.
You know who I'm talking about too, bro. So just came to mind. We were just there yesterday, but it's the same thing as, like, you've got to be good at something. It can't just be this sort of wishy-washy, you sort of do everything. It's just not a strategy that works. So.
Yeah, totally. And actually the restaurant example is a really, really good one, because, like, everybody goes to restaurants, and we've probably all been in those restaurants where their menu is like this 12-page novel that has every single, like, style, every like meal of the day, all of that stuff. And it takes you like an hour just to read it. Versus, and you generally know what the quality of food is going to be like in a place like that. Yeah. Versus if you go to the place where you walk in and they have, like, 4 mains and 5 sides and a few drinks, and that's it.
Yeah.
And you're just kind of like, you have to believe in the fact that those people have nailed those dishes and they're experts in that, and they want to deliver the best possible dish. And you can't do that when you have 100 dishes that you have to perfect across the menu, but you can do it when you have, like, 5.
Yeah.
Same kind of principle,
Yeah, it always intrigues me when I see the restaurants that, like, they have one and they do something different every day. They're rare, but I always find that so intriguing. And just like,
it is really
that
cool.
takes a lot of guts, but you get a dedicated following from it, right? So
and you're different. You know what I mean? Like, there's one restaurant that does a million things, there's this other restaurant that does a million things. You can't differentiate between the two, but everyone probably locally knows their favorite Italian place. That really has nailed it. And that, the same thing kind of applies across various industries, that kind of focus and choosing a few select things to become an expert in and do them really well.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting. The longer I'm in business, the more I realize, like when I first started in business, it's like, well, our business is different. That's what you think.
Yeah.
And now I'm like, we talk with entrepreneurs from everywhere, especially the business we're in. We're talking with businesses all the time. And I can barely go into any sort of shop, restaurant, liquor store, anything right now without like, hey, how's it going? How are you guys doing right now? Like, especially
Yeah,
this
me too.
COVID thing, right? And it's interesting because you find out that it's at a fundamental level, it's the same business challenges, and it's the same struggles and the same, how do you acquire customers? How do you bring them in? How much are they spending? And it's just, it's fascinating to me. And I love hearing about these other industries too, because you learn something, no matter what industry you're in, there's something you pull into yours and can kind of apply. And now it's just because everything's so volatile. I'm just, conversations with everybody.
Yeah, I'm curious to know, what's going on.
Yeah.
So, like there's in my neighborhood, I have this great little spot on the corner that has like a ultra tiny craft liquor store and a burger joint and like a deli.
Yeah.
And so I wandered down a liquor store and get beer from there. And I've gotten to know the guy. And so I was asking him how it's going. He's like, oh man, it's great. He's like, everyone wants a drink during a pandemic. I was like, that's fair. Yeah. So, different challenges obviously for different industries, but I like to think of those things in terms of like when we're talking to these businesses and noticing the similarities is that there's like macro problems and micro problems. And a lot of the time or like macro details and micro details, where like the macro, everyone kind of has the same thing, same things to deal with. It's positioning, it's supply and demand, all of that kind of stuff. It's delegation, things like that. And so we can speak the same language, whether or not you're kind of like a restaurant or an app development business owner, on the macro. And then on the micro is where it starts to get into specific details. You know what I mean? Where I'm like, oh yeah, like delegation, here's the theory and the theme of how I solve that problem, but I have no idea on the micro level how to handle delegation in a restaurant or anything like that.
Yeah.
But you can, like you said, you can pick stuff up, from different industries that you never thought you would have, been like, oh, here's how you handle delegation in this specific industry. It's totally different than I would have thought about it. Maybe I can adapt it to mine.
Yeah. Yeah. I find it's interesting too, because entrepreneurs, especially when they've been in business for a while, it's almost like you can recognize another one. And
right.
It's funny because you basically wonder how you guys doing, and they'll know like, oh, it's another entrepreneur, and they'll just like everything.
Yeah.
It's like, this is going on with this is how much money we make. Like it's amazing to me. But I find it so interesting and invigorating. And right now it's just, the business world is so volatile, and it's almost like day to day and week to week with massive fluctuations. And it'll be an interesting next number of months, and a tough one for a lot of businesses. And then some will excel, some will really excel through this too. And it's a really strange time, but we're hoping that it'll start to normalize at some point soon. So you talked a little bit about, I just want to circle back a little bit. And, I know we're getting sort of near our time here, and about sort of the turning point for your business. And I know you're talking about, this focus and everything. Can you give me a little bit more insight on like the processes and strategies that you've brought in that has been this sort of fundamental shift for you in the last little while?
Yeah, probably like outside of that kind of point where I was like, I need to pick a path here, either creative or business. The big turning point was probably around a year and a half ago when I made the call to restructure the company and actually put in your more traditional kind of middle management layer. And we're at that point, I don't know, can't remember we were probably around the same size we were now, like 17 or something like that, maybe 18 people. And I had been experimenting with this team-based model where, like each team had what I was calling a team lead, and they were like doing project management and being the manager for the people on their teams. And that was a total disaster. Not by any fault of any of the team leads, it's by fault of me. I made this role that was like if anybody could do that role, they would be running their own successful like consulting firm. And so I kind of bit the bullet and decided to make these director roles and stop trying to do everything myself. And that took a long time, right? That took like 9 years of business for me to finally stop trying to do it all myself. And is, just like everybody says, that's really important to figure out. And I was so bullheaded about it. It took me way too long. But that was the turning point, because then all of a sudden I was like, okay, like essentially like the 3 people I put in these director roles, they had become accountable for the entire delivery of what we do, our service delivery arm. Now I'm only really responsible for sales and, managing them. And like, you think about it, it's a total no-brainer, like there's no way you can do delivery, client service, design, development, all that stuff, and sales, and like office admin. But I was trying to have all of these responsibilities piled on me. It wasn't doing any particularly well. And, when you delegate, I think the biggest challenge everybody has, and why it was kind of the turning point for me, but the biggest challenge everybody has is that we look at somebody and we say like, well, I can do this in an hour and it's going to take them 3. And so why would I not just do it myself? Or it's going to take me 3 hours just to teach them how to do it. So why would I not just do it myself? But it makes for this not scalable business, right? Where you're ended up doing everything. And, the cumulative gain of having 3 people doing all of the things that you shouldn't be doing, there is a net positive there. And then, for me, I could direct more of my energy to sales. And the other side of it too, honestly, is that the people that went in those roles were better at me in all of those roles anyways. So it was just like double whammy of people handling the delivery side and the client service side, and doing a better job of it. And then me having more time for sales and building out the other processes in the business, doing that more effectively as well. And that made a big turning point for us. And we had our best year following that decision, which kind of proved it, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting because you're not the first podcast guest I've had on to specifically talk about delegation and how that's changed. It changed the business and actually gives you room now. The business can grow, and you're not going to have these roadblocks. You can actually start to scale and start to expand much more easily. And I know myself with a point of difficulty now as we like, as I sort of delegate these roles, and there's people much smarter than me and doing things that that they should be doing. But the tricky part for me as CEO is to figure out, where do you sort of step in and where do you step back? Where do you add some, where are you adding value? Where are you adding, where can you intervene if you think things are going off track? Where do you trust them? It's a really delicate balance and a really delicate, a tricky spot. And so but it comes along with that delegation is how do you can't just sort of walk away and, leave, right? And it's still
on you. Yeah. It's still on you to manage it, right? Like at the end of the day, you're the top level manager at some point.
Yeah.
But yeah. And that's like, for me, that's where it was more about adopting systems. Like, we don't drink the Kool-Aid too hard, but we follow EOS, the entrepreneurial operating system. And I actually dipped my toes into that water probably 4 or 5 years ago. At the time, I was like, I don't need this. Like, this is way too much. And it was too much because we didn't need all that. Yeah. But now, once I kind of delegated that mid-level management type of role, then I kind of ran into what you were talking about, Blaine, where it was like, okay, how do I know these people are doing a good job? And how do I know like when to let them touch the stove to figure out it's hot versus just telling them that it's hot and not to do that? And that's where the system starts to come into play. And we had a lot of kind of points. They call it I think it's like a wheel or like a cog. And we had like a bunch of those points the wheel already figured out. So it wasn't too hard to adopt. But it does become this whole thing where it's like, well, if you're going to delegate, then you need to like understand how to delegate, and you need to have KPIs to figure out if they're succeeding or not. And you need to have, meeting rhythms to make sure that nothing gets too far off track and that you're being proactive, and so on and so forth. And so like that's, again, one of those things where I kind of figured out the same way with positioning, where I'm just like, there's a reason everybody is talking about niches and positioning, and there's a reason that everybody is talking about systems. And when you're ready as a business owner, they'll make sense to you and you can adopt them.
Yeah.
And I just wasn't ready for that until, like a year and a half ago. And it made a big difference, but you kind of can't have one like delegation work effectively without having all the other pieces of the system in place.
Yeah, yeah, and it's we're familiar with that too. I'm a big believer in EOS, and and that's the reason is because there's a point where business where it's the processes and systems and discipline that really can help it grow and excel and you don't want to figure, like you said earlier, it's you're figuring out what is a PO, like at
Yeah,
some point
totally.
you don't know that stuff, and now years later you're getting into some really specific dedicated systems that are disciplined and some of the things that we've implemented, and they're always trying to improve, but how do you efficiently keep everybody, like find out where everybody's on task, and how do you help each other, but you got to do it really efficiently
Yeah.
and on point. And I highly recommend any business that's in that growth stage, don't just sort of sprint, like get those systems and processes in place, because that's what's going to help you do it. So
Yeah, and roll them out. And like what works for us generally is to assume that we don't know what we don't know. And so to adopt the entirety of something and then try to follow it to the letter of a law for a while until we really understand it. And then we can start to adapt it. Because I
yeah,
think what happens sometimes is we look at these systems and we say like, we don't need to do that. And we don't need to know this or do this. But we don't know what those two things kind of do underneath the surface. And so it can, the same thing, we adopt Kanban as a delivery method, like a project management system. And we try to follow that like pretty specifically, because when we tried to like do a pseudo adoption of it about 4 years ago, it wasn't working. And then we were like, oh, Kanban doesn't work. It's like, no, it's the way that we adopted it. Like it was a system designed to work, and you can't just remove, like one of the screws and expect the whole thing to function properly.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. There's a balance between and as an entrepreneur, we always think we know everything.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
You dive in and and there's always hard lessons, and it's comes from experience. When they say comes from experiences, it's because they screwed up and you learn
Yeah.
from it. Hopefully, don't do it the next time. So, this was a great conversation. I'm so glad to have you on the show, and I was such an interesting one. It's such a similar journey, and coming from just a very small business and growing it in something that has these processes and systems in place and is scalable and ready to go. And so where are you at today? I know we're kind of in the middle of weird COVID time right now, but what are your, like, I know you're starting to head into a niche in the next couple of years, but
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about what you're doing today, and what your passion is.
So right now, like I said, we've grown the shop a little bit, and we've repositioned very recently. We haven't actually even done too much talking about it yet, but into this focus on web and mobile apps. So like everybody, within April and May, we got hit by COVID pretty good. We had, I think in the course of a week, we had $500,000 of work either get canceled outright or delayed indefinitely, which for us is that's a pretty big pill to swallow. But we were able to avoid any layoffs or pay cuts or anything like that, and now things are picking back up. So, we rolled out a new site, out a whole bunch of new marketing technology and a content strategy for the first time ever, which is great to help with all this positioning work. So we're really going to dive into that. We're at 18 people. It's really hard to project growth for us in terms of personnel, but we're aiming to grow in the next year or so to about 23 people. And then after that, the way we've mapped it out now in the longer term, we're aiming to be about a 35-person shop. And again, that's not based on necessarily dollars, although it has to be at a certain point, but it is based on what we think the teams need to look like to support enterprise mobile and web applications, which is where we really want to dive into, and like the combination of those things. Like some of our favorite projects have been not just like a mobile app, but a whole software as a service platform, where it has a mobile app and the API and the web app and the infrastructure that connects everything and keeps it running. So, we need to have certain types of roles and certain types of teams in order to do that type of work. And, we need to have certain types of directors with particular areas of expertise to support teams of that size. And then you just start doing the math, and you end up at like, I guess we need to have a shop of 35 people to do the kind of work that we want to do. So right now, that's what we're aiming to do, and that's where our focus is, and really trying to own that space in the regional market. And then, like I said, we're giving ourselves room to be flexible and adaptable as always. I like to think of our plans as being sketched out in pencil. And then, going forwards, we'll see if we want to reposition into like that industry specific niche, or, we talked about stuff like maybe it's app services for regulated industries, because we do a lot of that type of work, but we'll see. And that's the kind of stuff that I find enjoyable these days is, like figuring out the strategy and direction and position of the company. And then also I do enjoy the early stage conversations with prospective clients, you know what I mean? Whether or not it's they end up working with us. Half the time, I think I'm the worst salesman in the world, just because I steer people away from spending $100,000 on something that is like destined to fail. But those, like those early stage conversations where we're figuring out fit and if we can help and all that kind of stuff, that's what I'm passionate about. So all those things kind of marry together into a good plan for the next few years for us, which I think will be fruitful.
Yeah. That's terrific. How can people find you if they do want to reach out to you? They want to chat with you maybe about a project or whatever. How can they find you?
Yeah, just our website is probably the best bet. It's paper-leaf.com. So paper-leaf.com. And everything is on there, a bunch of case studies and a whole bunch of lead capture forms.
Yeah, I'm familiar with those. Yeah, no, terrific. Well, I'll and we'll put them in the notes here as well. Yeah, thanks so much for joining me today, Jeff. This was a really great conversation. What I enjoyed thoroughly is it was I was kind of moving down a similar path until I moved into the Dryrun space here, and it was there's a lot of sort of familiarity there and challenges that you realize other people go through as well. And so it's really a really enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Likewise. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much. Appreciate it.